Welcome to a walk around Main Street, Poultney, and a journey into American history. I'm Willem Lang, and I'll be your guide on a tour that explores one town's connections with American history. We'll get to know a town that evolved from the frontier into a trading center, a town shaped by farming and quarrying, by tourism and teaching. More than 3/4 of the buildings in this historic district are considered historically intact. They've stood through the eras that define this town. And each era brought a new wave of immigrants who mixed their home culture with the community already here. On this walk, we'll visit 2 centuries of history. There are changes here, certainly, but Poultney today is not so different from Poultney yesterday. Now let's begin. We're standing above U.S. Route 30 that follows the old Poultney Turnpike. Before the turnpike, the mail post was an uncertain event at best, and travel was no faster than walking. But in 1806, some enterprising investors formed the Poultney Turnpike Company to create a toll road. 100-man labor parties and ox-drawn plows smoothed the rough and twisting trail. At the end of one 4th of July work party, the townspeople celebrated with a community dinner and 16 toasts to the patriotic diggers and to the ladies who got the meal. By 1811, the new privately owned Poultney Turnpike was completed, connecting the town to other turnpikes and toll roads. Poultney's location was a strategic halfway point in the 2-day journey between Burlington to the north and the Hudson River near Albany to the south. The turnpike secured Poultney's role as a prosperous transportation center from the 1800s and into the 1840s. Until the canals and then the railroads were built, this turnpike was the best route for stagecoaches and wagons, which brought regular mail to the frontier. Local farmers could transport their produce to markets in Albany. Cattle prodders, herding their stock to the markets of Boston, would pause here for the night. This commerce would bring competition between the townspeople of this village, once called West Poultney and known as a small milling hamlet, and the more prosperous East Poultney. These 2 villages, west and east, grew up side by side 2 miles apart. A rivalry between the villages centered on the location of the post office for the entire township. East Poultney argued that the post office should be located in the east, where all the churches were. West Poultney countered by hauling limestone by ox cart at great expense to build this Methodist church, completed in 1822. Such a grand stone church tipped the balance. When added to the impacts of the flood of 1811 and the completion of the Poultney Turnpike, the stone church ensured the eventual move of the post office to the west side, which effectively made this the center of town. And that's why West Poultney is known today simply as Poultney. From 1841 until 1869, the building was occupied by the Millerite sect, whose leader, a one-time Baptist minister from the Poultney area named William Miller, had forecast the second coming of Christ at various dates between 1843 and 1844. Based on this prophecy, the followers gave away their goods and went atop a hill to wait. After the forecast went unfulfilled, this came to be known as the Great Disappointment, and the Millerite movement began to unravel. Its followers returned to their original churches or joined other movements such as the Shakers, as well as launching the Adventist movement. In 1869, the Masonic Society purchased the stone church and occupied it for over a century. They added the Greek Revival portico with Doric columns sometime after 1918. Before a road cut was bulldozed around 1935, this part of Main Street was far steeper, a perfect place to sled. As Ed Lewis and Doc Williams remember,
we used to start on Stone Church Hill there.
Yep.
And slide. It was a lot steeper then, right in front of the Masonic Temple, in front, and slide down the main street.
Well, we'd go sliding after supper. We'd slide all evening, and there was only one car an hour.
This imposing Greek Revival-style home offers architectural proof of the wealth that migrated as commerce and industry shifted from east to west Poultney. Industrialist Henry Ruggles built this house in 1845 to be near the water-powered machine shop and foundry that he had purchased from Henry Stanley, where the famous Stanley stoves were fabricated. Ruggles, of course, renamed the business the Ruggles Foundry. The house has an unusual configuration, an entrance porch with 2 fluted Doric columns. It has a spiral staircase, and over 100 cast-iron rosettes surround the paneled windows in the entrance hall. The red slate chimney, a covered entrance known as a porte cochere, and the rear wing were added in the 20th century. Poultney was the halfway point on the turnpike and proved to be a welcome break in a long journey where passengers could rest overnight. As early as 1800, an inn and tavern operated here. In 1824, Joel Beeman built this current building as a stage station along the route of the old turnpike, serving travelers through most of the 19th century. Stagecoaches stopped here to change horses. The 3-stall barn behind the house served as the stables. At its peak, the hotel accommodated about 30 guests. After canals and railroads replaced stagecoaches, Beeman's Hotel became primarily an inn. The practical nature of housing guests led to periodic remodelings of the hotel, with many design errors apparent in this single building. The Victorian porch is probably a newer addition, while the recessed door with sidelight windows may be the oldest element. The house to the left, once part of the Beeman Hotel, was detached, moved, and reconstructed in the 1940s as a separate home. Poultney was a town of turnpikes and travelers, but also a town deeply rooted in religion. Here at the United Methodist Church, we note a second milestone in the concentration of industry, commerce, and education in West Poultney. Built in 1841, it was a replacement for the stone church to the east. The church was moved, in part, to serve a new population in town, the students of Troy Conference Academy, founded at the west end of Main Street in 1834 as a Methodist school for higher learning. Church services were considered a daily part of the lives of the citizens, students, and faculty of the town, twice on Sunday. So the local Methodist Society built this church in a more central part of town, which allowed enough time for the students to walk back to the academy for the midday meal and return in time for the second service. The design of the church comes from a pattern book authored by Asher Benjamin, who brought classical architecture to the American frontier. The builder was Charles Scott, son of Elisha, who had constructed many of the landmark buildings in East Poultney. For $12,000, the Poultney Graded School was constructed in 1885, a year after Vermont's native son, Chester A. Arthur, had completed his presidency. Now, immigrants were arriving to work the nearby slate quarries. The graded school, in its scale and size, was constructed to accommodate a growing population of the town's children, immigrants and locals alike. Equally important, it marked a change from the dispersed one-room schoolhouses to a centralized education system. The school's design echoes the gravity of its mission. The era when it was constructed, the post-Civil War Gilded Age, so-called, was noteworthy for social change and prosperity. It was also noted for an eclectic blend of building styles. The graded school features the tall windows typical of Italianate design, the fancy filigree of Queen Anne, and the balanced wings of colonial revival. Former students Ed Lewis and Doc Williams tell what it was like to learn your values here.
I remember the first day I went to school down there, they rung a bell for you to come in. It's time to come in. And everybody run like the dickens, and I was the first one up to the door. And Mrs. Van Guyler grabbed me by the shirt and said, "You go out to the sidewalk and walk in here like a gentleman." That was my first experience at Poultney Elementary School.
And when you got out, school was dismissed. You all went out in the hall and you lined up and you walked out to the street, and they had a bass and a snare drum and two people playing. And when I was in the second grade, you got out of line or out of step, Minnie Carlton would have you right by the ear and yank you right out, and you paid for it somehow.
Today, the schoolrooms have been reconfigured as the schoolhouse apartments, which serve senior citizens living in the town of Poultney. Reacting to the shift in population and prestige, religious congregations in the East Village moved to join the Methodists in the West Village. In 1866, both the Episcopalians and the Baptists began holding services on alternate Sundays in Poultney Village. In 1868, Trinity Episcopal Church was erected on the newly graded Church Street in Gothic Revival style with narrow and steeply pointed arch windows. The crisp roofline contrasts with the square steeple. On this roof, you see the geological trait that helps to define Poultney. It's slate. The first slate quarry in the area opened in 1845. The range of slate colors, black, green, red, even purple, makes our region unique and our slate a key element to the town's economic growth. Note the color of the red slate repeated in the red door. With its complementary colors and red rosettes, this is one of the more stunning examples of slate work in Poultney. Now, these slate roofs last up to 150 years if well cared for. Here's one of those school kids, Doc Williams, remembering how it was to grow up and work with slate in the quarries and on the roofs.
Slate is a boom or bust thing. You know, you're busy for a while and then the market goes down. And I went roofing. And I roofed it for off and on for 20 years. I retired off it. I can get on the street and say I worked on that one, that one, that one. I don't know why I haven't been on that one. I've been on all the churches, and both churches in East Poultney and all the schoolhouses except the new elementary.
This quiet, grassy trail next to the old depot buildings was once the site of bustling commerce along the railroad that ran from Rutland to Poultney to Albany and on to New York City. This was the route of the slate picker, the rail line that hauled slate from the quarries, agricultural and industrial products, and the immigrants who worked here. Soon after much of Poultney's toll road traffic had been taken away by the canal system to the west, two rival railroad syndicates made plans to connect Rutland County to Albany. Only one of the routes, the Rutland and Washington Railroad, planned to run through Poultney. Its proponents included Amos Bliss, the storekeeper and newspaper owner who'd given Horace Greeley his start, the industrialist Henry Stanley, and the banker Merritt Clark. Public opinion was against it, as it was regarded as visionary. There was even a rumor that to bolster support, the proponents collected signatures from convicts and from soldiers serving in the Mexican War. The tracks reached Poultney in 1851 at a cost of $1 million, and the arrival of train service cemented the ascendancy of West Poultney over East. People moved west, and so did the businesses, churches, post office, and schools. By 1857, the shift became official. The West Poultney Post Office was renamed the Poultney Post Office. In this same year, during the Panic of 1857, the stock prices of the Rutland and Washington Railroad plummeted, and a 21-year-old man named Jay Gould bought up the stock. He inflated its value and sold out in a year, beginning a pattern that would make him one of the richest and most infamous robber barons of the era. But the greed, growth, and speed of daily living were beginning to concern some people. As a writer in the Rutland Herald noted, Now we are scarcely satisfied with 30 miles per hour in those flying machines called railroad locomotives. We begin already to talk of 100 miles per hour. Soon we'll outstrip time herself and get there before we leave. The speed increased and the growth continued. In 1868, the wooden depot was built to handle freight and passengers. Its thick jigsawed braces supported the broad boxed eaves, offering protection against the weather. In 1917, this entire wooden depot was moved back from the street to make room for the new brick depot, which served a line incorporated with the Delaware and Hudson Railroad. Sylvia and Newman Williams, long-time Poultney residents, said that in the early years of the century, it was the place to be.
Everybody went down to the railroad tracks to watch the train come in, to see what was going on. That was the fight of the day, was to see them coming into Poultney on the train. It was just a tradition, I guess, to watch the world arrive.
But in 1934, as the entire country struggled through the Great Depression, the train stopped its passenger service to Poultney. The nationwide halt and building crippled the local slate industry. Together, these economic blows slowed the pace of new construction and help explain why Poultney today retains so many historic buildings. After its service as a train station ended, the brick depot was converted for use as a restaurant, and after the tracks were removed, the former rail line became a rail trail, used for year-round recreation. Before the automobile economy, every town had to provide its own commercial center. Poultney had 5 department stores, dry goods stores, restaurants, stables, and several photographic studios. The downtown served local residents and more than 1,000 quarrymen who worked in some 250 quarries in the area. The Humphrey Block, also known as the Journal Press Building, was built in 1904 in a neoclassical revival style, presenting a sense of strength and stature that typified buildings of the Gilded Age. It features pressed metal ceilings, and the cement and concrete blocks were also pressed on-site from scratch. This building is the longtime home of printing businesses, including the old newspaper, the Poultney Journal. The advertisements in the paper might tempt you to spend your wages on a range of goods: oysters, potatoes, sirloin and porterhouse steak, silk and brocades. Here you could find the variety and competitive prices unavailable from the company store run by the quarry. At one time or another, this building housed a bowling alley, a community center, a dry goods store, barber shop, pool hall, saloon, and the U.S. Post Office. Customers arrived on the electric-powered Poultney Castleton trolley, which had a turnaround stop just out front. Downtown owed its bustle to the industries and quarries, which in turn depended on local and immigrant workers. Workers from slate quarries in Wales launched the first wave of immigration in 1850. The Welsh were soon joined by subsequent waves of immigrants, skilled quarrymen or miners from Poland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Italy, Ireland, Hungary, and Canada. This immigration continued through the 1890s and into the early 1900s. Sylvia Williams, co-founder of the hardware store with her husband Newman, remembered the Welsh influence in Poultney.
Saturday night was live in Poultney then. All the stores were open, and all the farmers and everybody, they came to town on Saturday night. And you would walk down the street. In those days, a good portion of the people were speaking Welsh. It's a Welsh community, but now you'd never hear it. But in those days, you did, because everybody was out, and quarrymen would come in, and the farmers would come in, and it was a fun night. It really was.
This house was built around 1830 and was soon acquired for the Methodist parsonage. It's noted for the flat-roofed Queen Anne porch with fancy turned posts and cut-out florals and a four-sided hip roof with a cresting cover in slate. At least 2 renovations added to the eclectic nature of the house, reflecting the many building patterns that have blended during Poultney's history. After its use as a parsonage, it served as a doctor's office and then a bed and breakfast. This unique building, the one-time home of Mr. and Mrs. James Farnham, also housed Poultney Village's first public library. It opened in 1895, just 4 months after a library initiative was launched. The first book the library received was The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. That first summer, it offered 700 books. The house is the only one in this historic district that blends brick construction with Queen Anne style. The main structure was built in the mid-1800s with the Queen Anne elements added around 1885. Note especially its narrow width, the bay windows, and the wood fanlight with a sunburst over the front doorway. The Two Editors Inn, dating to the 1830s, was named to honor Poultney's connection to 2 pioneering newspaper publishers, Horace Greeley and George Jones. Horace Greeley, a newspaper editor, reformer, and politician, began his career in East Poultney, where he befriended and worked with George Jones. Jones was an East Poultney native who later worked with Greeley on the New York Tribune and then co-founded the New York Times. This Greek revival home appears to be in its original condition. It's noted for its monumental columns anchoring an open slate porch. The Reverend Jesse Peck, principal of the Troy Conference Academy, was most likely the original owner and lived here in the 1840s and 1850s. Today, the Two Editors Inn is maintained by Green Mountain College for its visitors. Green Mountain College sits on 155 acres, framing the far west end of Poultney Village and continuing the town's long heritage as a home for education. In the 1830s, as the Methodist movement grew, the Regional Troy Conference was formed to support more than 60 churches in upstate New York and Vermont. It was the Troy Conference in 1834 that formed the Troy Conference Academy, now known as Green Mountain College. The college might not have been located in Poultney, though, if it hadn't been for the foresight of the townspeople. The conference noted the beauty, healthfulness, temperance, good order, and freedom from influences baneful to a school of Poultney. But the gift of some $6,000 from the townspeople clinched the deal. In 1863, the school's name changed to Ripley Female College, in part due to a lack of male students who were fighting in what the locals at the time called the War of 1861. The college became a leader in the women's educational movement and was the first college in Vermont to graduate a woman. One of the first graduates was Anna Catherine Green, whose 1878 novel, The Leavenworth Case, A Lawyer's Story, was an early American bestseller. Some refer to Green as the mother of the detective novel. The school reverted to Troy Conference Academy in 1874 and changed again in 1931 when the academy launched Green Mountain Junior College, the first junior college in Vermont. And again, during World War II, Green Mountain reverted to a college for women. The school returned to its co-educational mission in 1974, changing its name to Green Mountain College and offering 4-year bachelor's degrees. In the 1990s, the college developed a curriculum focused on the environmental liberal arts and has become a leader in the sustainability education movement on college campuses. Through all these years, the fortunes of the college and the community have been intertwined. The students remember the town fondly. Sylvia Williams certainly did.
There was one little store next door to the Journal Press, and Mrs. Dimickle, that was Mrs. Dimickle ran her restaurant, a little small restaurant there. And we had to go to chapel at the college 3 times a week, and we finished at 10. And if you hurried, you could skinny downtown and go to Mrs. Dimickel's, and you could get a piece of her chocolate cream pie for 10 cents. She only made a couple of them, and if you wanted one, you had to get there first. And they didn't last long. It was delicious.
The Bentley House and the Richardson House across the street on the college campus are characteristic of the Victorian homes built by Poultney's new wealth, created by the mercantilism that served the immigrants working in the slate quarries. The Bentley is a well-conserved example of the so-called painted ladies, typical of the grander Victorian-era homes. Gaudy, colorful, and irregular describe the Queen Anne style, and the Bentley House includes many of the typical features, an asymmetrical design with an offset tower. It was built in 1895 by a real estate broker for his son, a merchant named William Broughton, who married Jane Edwards. Now, Jane's sister lived across the street at 9 Bentley Avenue. She married one of the sons of Robert Humphrey, who'd built the Humphrey Block and operated the newspaper. Not to be outdone by the neighboring homes or by her sister, she and her husband constructed this imposing Queen Anne colonial revival-style home about 1900. Note the decorative qualities and intricate design of these Queen Anne homes, more evidence of a wealth earned from the town's unique blend of resources and commerce. These were homes built in the Gilded Age from the 1880s to the 1900s. Note the unpredictable window spacing, the various and ornate colors, and woodwork that features turned columns and geometric patterns made possible in part by the introduction of machine lathes. Rufus Broughton, the real estate broker who built the Bentley House for his son, built one of the more striking homes on the street in 1885 in a Queen Anne Eastlake style with an unusually ornate porch at the corner of Bentley and Roberts Avenues. Peek down Roberts Avenue and note the roof on the second house, a striking multicolored slate roof. The stone building that now houses the Poultney Public Library was built in 1910 as home to the Citizens National Bank, which closed during the Depression. Its neoclassical revival style features rusticated marble, which creates a bold appearance with deep joints and shadow lines. Over 2 centuries of operation, the town's libraries have had many homes, starting in East Poultney in 1790. Later, a library was housed across the street at Mrs. James Farnham's house, and then moved to the old town hall in 1900. During the period the library was in town hall, the Red Cross set up emergency rooms in 1918, most likely for the Spanish flu epidemic. At one time, the library's Board of Trustees approved a nursery school there on the condition that a 3-foot wall separated the children from library patrons. When the Puritan Dress Company asked to use the entire town hall first floor, another location had to be found for the library. It moved here in 1957. Because of the smaller space, the library had to dispose of over 7,000 books and some unique collections, including a display of birds from 1915, now part of the Poultney Historical Society's collections in East Poultney. This building is named in honor of a former owner, Thankful Mears, the daughter of Solon Sherman, who operated the grist mill behind the house. Her grandfather, Olcott, a harness maker, moved from East to West Poultney in 1835, and it's likely he built this house shortly thereafter. Built around 1840, this brick Greek Revival house has a lovely curved stairway in the entrance hall. At the turn of the last century, Harry Sherman operated the feed and grain business in the mill house behind this building. His wife Alice had a photographic studio next door, which she reached by a tunnel under the drive, avoiding the winter snow. The next stop is 2 buildings down, a solid all-brick building. The building dates back to the early 1800s, when the town was just being settled. In the mid-1800s, this building served as an office to a successful town doctor. After his retirement, a young couple used the building for a barber shop. As with many buildings in town, this was built in stages. The second floor was added later, as evidenced by 2-colored brickwork and the late-era Victorian trim on the cornices. By the turn of the 20th century, those who'd arrived as immigrants 50 years earlier to work in the slate quarries had been assimilated. By now, they'd built fine houses, and their children and grandchildren were working in the trades and professions. The earliest and largest of these immigrant groups, the Welsh, built this Welsh Presbyterian church in 1901. Sheathed in multicolored slate and sitting on a quarry stone foundation, this church reflects the work and the spirit of its parishioners. It features straight and uplifting Gothic structures contrasted with such Queen Anne filigree as fish scale and diamond shingles. In the 1920s and 30s, this church sponsored the Welsh Male Chorus, whose singers performed nationally. Today, it's the last surviving Welsh church in Vermont. The stone bridge has been here since nearly the beginning of Poultney. Like the town itself, this house has seen many changes and survived times of prosperity and hardship. The stone bridge took its name from the stone bridge that crosses the nearby creek. The original house was built in 1808 by one of Poultney's first settlers, Thomas Ashley, for his daughter. He constructed a federal-style residence that forms the central part of what is now the stone bridge. The stone bridge has had many owners, many uses, and many remodels. Its owners both reflected and shaped the town's changing fortunes. In 1840, financier and politician Merritt Clark purchased the home and added the 2 wings and a Greek Revival front. Here he opened the first bank of Poultney in the west wing. The bank vault was in the cellar of this wing, where the foundation walls are 5 feet thick. Clark was credited with saving the Troy Conference Academy in 1848 by refinancing its debt. In 1901, the stone bridge became the property of F.W. Barrett, owner of the area's largest department store. In 1952, Dr. and Mrs. E.J. Swinyer bought the home. The doctor had his offices in the East Wing and practiced until his retirement in 1983. Quite a few Poultney residents still remember their visits to the doctor's office. The building was opened to the public the following year as the Stonebridge Inn, a bed and breakfast. Fire nearly destroyed the stone bridge in 1996. Afterward, the town of Poultney raised over $800,000 in grants and donations to restore the building to its original grandeur. It's now home to a variety of community service organizations, including the Poultney Visitor Center, and it's often open for an informal tour. Finally, we invite you to follow the other tours in this series, East Poultney and the Poultney Driving Tour. Together, these audio tours explore the Poultney area, a region that embodies the history of small towns in America. The Destination Poultney Tours are brought to you by the Poultney Historical Society, the Town of Poultney, and Green Mountain College, and are supported in part by a Preserve America grant administered by the National Park Service, Department of the Interior. For more information on the audio tours and other attractions, drop by the Poultney Visitors Center at the Stone Bridge.